Our next keynote of the day is about making connections for real changes. Please allow me to speak. Sorry, can you listen to me? Okay. Please allow me to speak in Portuguese because we have 3 Portuguese speakers in this next panel. So let me introduce them. Primeiro, queria trazer o Fabio Barbosa, CEO do Grupo Abril. André Guimaraes, diretor executivo da Conservação Internacional. E Matthew Shirts, editor-in-chief da National Geographic Brasil, coordenador editorial do Planeta Sustentável e também colunista da Veja São Paulo. Obrigado.
Well, good morning. We're going to do this in English. We've been asked to do it in English, and everyone here speaks the Queen's language. So, even though I have an American accent, we'll do it in English. Today, I've got 2 very special people with me, and I think we can have a spectacular talk. What I want to start the talk off with is what I think is one of the most important developments at Rio Plus 20, which is the notion of natural capital. We've seen several big companies, we've seen several banks, we've seen this concept that there is such a thing as natural capital being accepted by important players on the economic stage who have previously only thought about regular capital, about money. So I'm going to start off with André, and I'd like to ask him if he thinks that this is a concept that has come to stay. Is this an important concept for the discussion of sustainable development? And will it represent a paradigm shift coming out of Rio Plus 20?
Thanks, Matthew. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and going straight to the point you made, I think this is the concept for the future generations. Natural capital, first of all, needs to be understood. What is natural capital? Let me quote a number. I like numbers. You know, Brazil, for example. We're in Brazil. Brazil has grown 34% over the past 20 years.
34% in
GDP.
GDP.
You know, this traditional analysis that the United Nations, that the countries and the companies make. If you subtract the loss of forests, the degradation of land, the pollution of rivers, the changes in climate of this number, we end up growing only 3%. So the difference, the balance between the 34 GDP growth and the 3% that we actually grew, it means that Brazil eliminated, or the growth of Brazil was based on its natural capital. So we have to take into account, on one hand, the risks of not calculating well or not incorporating in our balance sheets and in our decision-making processes the natural capital, which is, on one hand, pollution, degradation, etc. But on the other hand, we have to look at the opportunities that the natural capital bring to us in terms of new opportunities, organic agriculture, using biodiversity for cosmetics, as the company Natura in Brazil does. Using, I don't know if you know that, but about 40 or 42% of the cancer medicines are based on biodiversity. So incorporating or taking advantage of the natural capital to do business, to improve the quality of life, at the end of the day means that we'll have human well-being based on the correct use of the natural capital.
Fabio, let me ask you, is this practical? It sounds very, very alluring to me. It's very enticing intellectually. From a businessman's point of view, you've been the president of several banks. You're now the president of one of the largest media companies in Brazil, in the South America. Can we incorporate this in a practical way into business?
Well, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Matthew, for being here. What he's talking about, Andre, I agree very much. And people talk about pricing externalities. Products are not properly priced. So whenever you buy something, you think it costs the society 10 reais, $10, it may cost a lot more. And so incorporating that is very important. However, as we were discussing a moment ago and also in another forum, I think at the end, it will have to come a little bit the pressure from society again. I'm very much optimistic that we are now discussing here social media, because I believe, and I'm optimistic also, as Andrea was saying, that there are many opportunities that will come, provided that society understands exactly what is good and what is bad. So education of the consumer, and the consumer pressuring the companies so that the companies start properly disclosing what they are doing, I think is the key concept. We will have for instance, as we're talking about new products, new technologies will be driven by consumers pressuring. So that's why I like the idea of having the social media, people talking to each other and alerting to what are the impacts caused by this and that. Over time, I believe the concept that he's saying, that pricing things properly will be a reality, but it will demand more pressure from society, especially from the young people saying, I would like to know. For instance, just a quick example, a colleague of mine was saying that he was surprised when he saw consumers asking how much CO2 does it come from 100 kilometers ridden by a car. So he wanted to know that model. So he was trying to compare things that in the past was never asked. So these things are being asked. At a point in time, this will be also cost for fuel and so I believe that consumers may put the pressure on and get this done.
Let me stay with you a minute here, Fabio. Now, putting on your as the president of Abril, and which has more than 50 magazines at the company and all sorts of websites and all sorts of social media, do you see? I should say our company, because we work at the same company. Do you see our company putting that pressure on the companies? Do you see us educating the consumers in that fashion? Do you think that will sell magazines?
I think that at the end, it's a circle. And I don't see any more the top-down things happening. So it's not up to the media, to the government, or to the academy to do that. It's up to each one of us. So things are coming. And I normally say, as a sentence which summarizes what I think, I say that my generation may not have left a better world for our children, but it sure left better children for our world. So these people are a lot more conscious, and they understand, and they like to know more about it. Therefore, as they get more interest, I think the media will come also and will provoke new thoughts, and over time companies will develop new products, new opportunities will come, and the magazines will then reflect that. So I believe it's a process. It's going the right direction. We may challenge here whether we are going at the right pace or not, but certainly we are going to the right direction. So I think, yes, there is a increasing interest, but it has to do also with education, with new mentality, new mindset, and that's more on the young people. So I'm very optimistic about the future.
Okay, thank you, Fabio. Going back to you, Andre. Now you work for Conservation International, and Fabio is very optimistic. How do you see the future of conservation? Is conservation making a difference, and will it make a difference in the future?
That's a great question. Conservation International is just celebrated its 25th anniversary in January of this year. And throughout this more than 2 decades of work, we've focused our efforts and our science and our energy into, among other things, creating protected areas. And I want to connect that to Fabio's point here in terms of the importance of education, the importance of making sure that the young people, making sure that the public, making sure that the consumers are well informed. Protected areas, national parks, extractive reserves, ecological reserves, and so on and so forth, are often seen, at least in Brazil, as a liability. You know, it's an isolated area in which I can't use. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. Protected areas have to be seen as reservoirs of natural capital. They have to be seen as how can I say, as inventories, okay, as places in which we have our biodiversity preserved to use it correctly and smartly to our own benefit. These are places in which we protect water reserves, for example. Just to quote, we are in Rio de Janeiro. Rio de Janeiro is a city that has a bay that separates the eastern and the western part of the city. The western part of the city of Rio de Janeiro is an area, a city called, a municipality called Niterói. Niterói has about 4 million people. These 4 million people depend upon water that comes from from a state park. Mm-hmm. So people need to understand.
Which park?
The Parque dos Três Picos. I can't translate that in English.
Three Peaks. Three Peaks Park. Yeah.
Okay. It's up in the mountains, and all the water springs that would supply water to Niterói would come from this park. So people need to know that. On one hand, how important are the protected areas to supply the necessary assets or the necessary natural capital that we need for our lives, and that's a crucial role that the new medias, the social medias, have to play, because the consumers, once again, and the young people and the voters at the end of the day need to know that, and the efficient way to reach this audience is the social media.
Yes, Fabio.
Just to complement, because sometimes people put this idea of the natural capital he's referring to and other externalities as something that is not up to the business to look at. And I just would like to make two remarks. Number one, that research are showing that companies which look into the environmental impact, or actually the impact they cause on the stakeholders, they perform better than the companies which are not looking into it. So sustainability index and all those normally will show companies performing better, because it's a way of properly managing the company. The second point I want to make is that any business proposition has to look into the future and what kind of opportunities you have. So you cannot have a business proposition which is not sustainable, be it because of pressure from consumers, be it because you exhausted the reserves, or the mining, or whatever. You have to look into things which will be done today and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Therefore, I think I was in another forum stressing that point, that we are a little bit prisoner of what Milton Friedman said, which is the business of business is business. Actually, what it means is the business of business is sustainable business, because it's not up to any business to have a proposition which ends on itself. It has to be something that perpetuates. So looking into the environmental and the impact you cause is part of the business responsibility.
Okay, I think you've both touched on very, very interesting points here. I think there's one of the big changes is that before, the general population didn't want to know what the CO2 emissions of a car are. They didn't need to know where their plastic bags go or don't end up or don't end up. They didn't need to understand, and even in business, you didn't understand the process from cradle to cradle, as you say, from the beginning to the end. And I guess at the end of the day, my question is: Are we smart enough as a species? Do we really want to know all these things? Are people interested? Are we going to be able to make them interested? And how do we do that?
Once again, Matthew, I think the answer to your question is to communicate well. I like to say that we environmentalists, we entrepreneurs, we leaders, we decision makers, we have to get out of our offices, we have to get out of our labs, we have to communicate well to people. When I go out in a shop to buy a car, I take into account a few elements. First of all, it's the price of the car, to see if it fits within my bank account. Second one is the color, then the equipment that the car has, then what's the level of status that car will going to give me. And then let me hold to this level of status thing. This is a very intangible and how can I say, aerial concept. But within this concept of the status that a car will bring to you, today, the bigger the car, the most expensive the car is, the higher status you have. Well, we need to make sure that another concept needs to be incorporated in the decision-making equation of a consumer, which is the level of emissions that that car brings. And if the neighbor looking at your car says, well, you have a big car and you're a big emitter, and that sounds bad to you, then you start changing your mind. So I think it's our responsibility, once again, the leaders, the decision makers, to make sure that the right information, the right concepts are passed on to the consumers, to the voters, to the public in general.
Fabio, I think that's a very interesting point, and I'd like you to say, what is the role of advertisers? How do you foresee, is the role of advertising going to change? Because pretty much up until now, when we advertise cars, we advertise the status of the big emitters, just to use the example of cars. Do you foresee a change there in advertising, or has advertising understood the message? Will it understand the message?
Yeah, you know, Matthew, I think at the end, as I mentioned, it's a process. We keep looking for someone who is going to break either governments, which will not do, or either the companies, which will not do. Again, it's up to us as consumers. Companies will advertise, also based on what they feel society is starting to attach value to. They create through some perceptions and some values, but they also respond to what is happening in society. I don't believe that they are disconnected and they are driving society this and that way, because people today are a lot more educated. They can make their own judgments, maybe in the past much less, today much more. Actually, social networks is of such an importance. And I'll give you an example. One of these days we're talking about a certain car, and people were saying, yeah, that's important, and I saw the advertising, this and this and that. But on top of that, I also want to check what my friends think about that car, and what, in terms of the experience they are having, in terms of what kind of perception it will cause when I drive this car. So there is something more going on. So I would say that advertising has a role, has to be talking the truth, has to be disclosing not only what they do properly on their products, but also something that maybe is not as good and that will be worked on. So it has a role, but I would bring it back to the same concept that we should not delegate. Today in Rio Plus 20, the big issue is, will the governments do or do not do? And again, the governments will do if society demands. Politicians are after votes, and votes will reflect, will come based on what people are perceiving as relevant. So if the society shows that, companies will come and governments will come. And advertising, I think, yes, it has a very important role, but is also part of this process.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more minutes here, 7.5 more minutes. Andre, one thing I'd like to talk about is changing a little bit the subject, is research. And research in the area of biodiversity. Researchers in biodiversity in Brazil, as you know, have traditionally had to leap over a lot of hurdles, particularly in this area where there's a big fear of piracy, of people stealing Brazil's biodiversity secrets. And I think it comes from what happened with the rubber boom a long time ago. How does Conservation International deal with this? Are you able to give permits for people to research on your protected lands? How do you work with scientists, and what kind of importance does your organization attach to that?
That's the $1 billion question, sir. Here's how I think. First of all, as I mentioned before, Conservation International has worked in Brazil for 22 years to protect areas. These areas are reservoirs of biodiversity, reservoirs of wealth, okay, to the society. In Brazil, particularly, we still don't have a legal framework that would allow us to smartly explore our biodiversity, unfortunately. So this is something that we need to inform the public. We need to do more research. We need to stimulate the academia, to stimulate scientists to do more research in order to identify what we have. You know, if we don't have the tools, just making a metaphor here, to dig the gold out of the soil, we will never get rich. So we need to make sure that the politicians are informed by scientists and comfortable with, and the public is comfortable with the politicians' laws, so that we can explore this wealth. Okay, this is on one hand. On the other hand, we need to have more, let's say, accuracy and more. My CEO, Peter Seligman, Conservations International CEO, has this wording which I like very much, which is we have to break the silos. So companies need to get out of their comfort zone. Scientists need to get out of their comfort zone. Politicians, again, we need to be influenced by each other. Fabio mentioned the Rio +20 politicians and the decision that they are holding and the pressures that they are suffering, etc. We need to put more pressure. We need to make sure that these politicians are out of their silos. We need to make sure that the corporations and the private sector decision makers are out of their silos to make sure that they are making the right decisions towards sustainability.
Well, Fabio, thank you very much, Andre. I've got a question from online here, and it addresses precisely what you're talking about. And it says, I'm gonna make this question. I'm gonna ask you this question. It says, well, how should governments and political institutions become more engaged in social media, in the social media discussion? Should they?
Yeah, I think they should actually be connected with society. If anything, the social media will take out one layer, will become much closer to the government if it works out properly. It will take time. There'll be new people, new mindset. Young people do that more easily. Old people do that. It's more difficult. We have to understand, again, the issue of it will take some time, but it will be very solid. So I think the government has to be and is being a lot more connected. I was on Saturday here on Rio +20. I think you're here. We'll talk about the Rio +20 dialogues, and that was something, an initiative of the Brazilian government to put up some subjects to be discussed and to be voted by social media. So it was a very, very important one. But I think the government will have also, it will be connected, it will be feeling the pressure from society, and it will have to develop its own goals. And I liked very much when we were discussing one of the most voted issues by the social media, as we discussed last Saturday, was really to come up with the sustainable development goals. In other words, we have to talk a lot, but we have to have some goals. And the business mentality will be very helpful on that, because I see business today very much committed. And business likes to work with goals, with metrics, and I think we have to do the same thing with environmental impact. So I'm very much optimistic that as an outcome of the Rio +20, if we don't have immediate goals now, we will have, like the Millennium Development Goals were very useful. I think the Sustainable Development Goals is a good proposition that I would like to see moving, and that would be connected with what society is demanding to the government.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a fascinating conversation. We've got a few minutes. I want to give each of you one more opportunity to speak, okay? And the Rio Plus Social event is about, why Rio +20, about social media, and about the future. So I'm going to ask both of you if you would each give me a minute of your time, of your thoughts about the future. What do you foresee, and what should we do in the upcoming years? And I'm talking about the next 5, not the next 10 or 20.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm totally with Fabio here that if we design correctly the objectives and the targets that we are aiming at reaching, we'll be making a big leap, making a big jump ahead. And I believe that society, not just politicians are just one aspect of society, but corporations, social groups, civil society organized, different levels of the government are sensible and sensibilized to the needs that we need to change, to the necessities that we have to put in front of us. I just wanted to finalize, Matthew, with a comment about Brazil. Brazil has a big responsibility, not just to be holding this event here in Rio, but because it is a mega diverse country. It's probably has the biggest biodiversity in the world. We have 12% of the fresh water in the world. So we are responsible for not just what happens within our territory, but we are responsible for our neighbors. or to collaboratively work with our neighbors, work with other developing countries, work with the developed world, work with Europe, with the United States, trying to find the solutions which are for the entire humanity. So I just would like to conclude saying that I believe that we'll come out of this meeting with indeed a route to the future.
Great, thank you. Fabio.
Just quickly, I was very impressed, and I was told earlier today that, talking about social media, that Avas had close to 1 million people which were voting for the forest code. So that is people mobilizing itself to do things and get things done. And interdependence is a key factor, as he said. At the end, everything is connected. And just as I have 13 seconds, just to say one thing, let's do not forget all the time that after all, the discussion is about human dignity, to have people having a better standard of living, and environment is a tool for us to guarantee that.
Thank you very much, both of you. That was spectacular.